The following was recorded by John Lothe and is intended for educational purposes. This recording is not to be sold or distributed for sale. If you wish to support the work and publishing of these recordings, please visit the John Lothe Patreon page. If you come across these recordings anywhere else without my expressed support, and find that they are requesting donations for presenting this work to you, you will not be supporting the creator by doing so. This is just a friendly warning to anyone who may fall prey to predatory practices I have come across recently. The Shape of Things to Come by H. G. Wells. Part 13. 1933. Progress comes to a halt. So we bring the history of mankind to that great pause in social expansion which concluded the first third of the 20th century. The year 1933 closed in a phase of dismayed apprehension. It was like that chilly stillness, that wordless interval of suspense that comes at times before the breaking of a storm. The wheels of economic life were turning only reluctantly and uncertainly. The millions of unemployed accumulated and became more and more plainly a challenge and a menace. All over the world, the masses were sinking down through distress and insufficiency to actual famine, and, collectively, they were doing nothing effectual in protest or struggle. Insurrectionary socialism lurked and muttered in every great agglomeration. But insurrection alone could remedy nothing without constructive ideas, and there was no power and energy yet behind any such constructive ideas as had appeared. The merely repressive forces, whatever their feebleness in the face of criminality, were still fully capable of restraining popular insurrection. They could keep misery stagnant and inoperative. Everywhere, in everything, there was an ebb of vitality. A decline in the public health was becoming perceptible. A diminishing resistance to infections and a rise in the infantile death rate was already very evident in the vital statistics after 1933. War was manifestly drawing nearer, in Eastern Asia and Eastern Europe. It loitered, it advanced, it halted, and no one displayed the vigor or capacity needed to avert its intermittent, unhurrying approach. Still, the immense inertias of the old order carried things on. Under a darkling sky, the majority of people were going about their business according to use and want. The unprofitable industries still carried on with reduced staffs. The shopkeepers opened their shops to a dwindling tail of customers. The unemployed queued up at the labor exchanges by force of habit, and some at least got a job. The landlord's agent no longer collected the rent that was due, but called for an installment of his arrears. The unfed or ill-fed children went sniffing to chilly schools to be taught by dispirited teachers on reduced salaries. But still the schools were not closed. The bankrupt railways and steamship lines ran diminished but punctual services. Hotels stayed open, not to make profits, but to mitigate losses. The road traffic lost something of its newness and smartness and swiftness, but still it flowed. The crowds in the streets moved less briskly, but, if anything, these sluggish crowds were more numerous, and the police, if less alertly vigilant, maintained order. There had been a considerable, if inadequate, building boom after the Peace of Versailles, but after 1930, new construction fell off more and more. Yet some builders found work. Necessary repairs were attended to. Burnt-out houses were reconditioned, for example. In 1935 and 1937, the world was swept by influenza epidemics of unusual virulence. The lowered resistance, already noted by the statisticians, was now made conspicuous by this return towards medieval conditions. But the doctors and nurses stuck to their duties stoutly, and the druggists and undertakers, whose affairs had long since been reorganized on big business lines, profited. Pictures of life in the shadows during this phase of devitalization are not very abundant, nor do they convey the essential misery into which a whole generation was born, in which it lived and died. One sees the rows of dilapidated houses, the wrecked interiors, and shabbily clad men and women standing about. In these pictures, they seem always to be just standing about. Descriptive journalism brings the student nearer to the realities of a life without space, color, movement, hope, or opportunity. There were a number of inquiries made, more particularly by the British, American, and French newspapers, and the tale they tell is always a tale of wheels slowing down to a stoppage, of factory gates being closed, of smokeless chimneys and rusting rails. Here is a vivid contemporary vignette to show how things were with millions of human beings during this strange phase of human experience. It is from the pen of H.M. Tomlinson, 1873 to 1969, one of the best of English descriptive writers. I chanced upon a little town above Cardiff last week. It was by pure chance. I had never before heard of the place. It is typical of these valleys, so never mind its name. It could have many names. Its population is, or was, about 6,000. Its people have faced trouble before. Less than 20 years ago, over 300 of its men perished in a mine explosion. We won't say the town got over that, for I spoke to those for whom the calamity is an abiding horror. It was a terrific defeat for them in the war upon nature, but survivors returned to the struggle and said no more about it. When first I saw the town from a distance, with the bleak, bare uplands about it, I was reminded of the towns once familiar, that were too near the battle line in France. It was midday and sunny, yet this conciliary town was silent and so still that it seemed under a spell. As a fact, it is under a spell. It is, in a way, dead. But its people cling to the empty shell of it. Where else can they go? At first sight, no people could have been there. Buildings in the foreground were ruins. The gaunt pithead gearing evidently had not moved for an age. The gaps in the blackened walls of the powerhouse suggested a home of bats and owls. The first man I met when I reached the end of its main street and saw then that the shops were not only closed, but abandoned, was standing on the curb. A man in the middle years, shrewd but not haggard, his clothes brushed till they were threadbare. "What's the matter with this town?" I asked. "On the dole." "Are you out too?" "Of course I'm out." "How long?" He was silent. He held up 5 fingers. "Months?" "Years." "Are all the men here the same?" "Most of 'em, and won't go back." He led me up a mound of refuse where a goat was eating paper, and he had a near view of the colliery itself. "That's the reason we won't go down again," he said. "How would you work it?" Whether by design or rust, a steel footbridge had fallen across the wide railway track which went to the pithead. A deflected stream guttered down between the metals, which were overgrown with grass and stagnant marsh stuff. The outbuildings were a huddle of dilapidation. It looked haunted. "Some men I knew," muttered my guide, "are still down there. There they'll stop. They've been there 19 years now. Would you call them lucky?" 2,500 men came out of the principal colliery 5 years ago. That is why the shops are shut, long rows of them with whitewashed windows and doorways filled with dust and straws. The woodwork of many houses has been taken for firewood. Even the cooperative store is shut, as well as the pawn shop. Thrift and thriftlessness mean the same thing in this town. Where I noticed that even nonconformist chapels with broken windows had been left to the rats and birds. Worse than the dismal shops and broken buildings are the groups of shabby men, all neat and tidy, standing listless and silent at the street corners, waiting. Waiting for what? Nothing. There is nothing to come. They are doomed, these parents, to watch a generation grow up with thin bones and a shadow on its mind. Their children learn the signs of the slow death about them when they should be at play. Children that have no childhood. Their homes are in a graveyard of human aspiration. The press and literature of that period make curious reading. It varied between a bleak, insincere optimism and hopeless desperation. An undignified viciousness and a jeering humor invaded popular art and literature. Strong, in manner and in flavor, rather than in any grasp upon the realities of contemporary life. There was always an abundant production and consumption of reassuring and deliberately cheerful books, a movement towards religious mysticism and otherworldliness, and a marked tendency towards repressive Puritanism. Excesses of libertinism provoke censorious and superstitious suppression. The two things are correlated aspects of a decline in human dignity. In the face of its financial and political perplexities, mankind was becoming neurasthenic. All neurasthenia has apparently unaccountable elements. To us today, it seems incredible that the way out of all these distresses was not plainly seen and boldly taken. There was a blindness and effortlessness that still exercised the mind of the social psychologist. The way was so plain that it was visible. It was indicated by hundreds of intelligent and detached observers as early as the 30s of the 20th century. Maxwell Brown, in his study of the modern state idea, has 2 supplementary volumes of citations to this effect. Such phrases, for example, as cosmopolis, inflation, and public employment, from a British provincial newspaper article in 1932, do state, in general terms at any rate, the line of escape for the race. These are crude, ill-defined terms, but manifestly they have in them the shape of the ultimate reconstruction. Cosmopolis foreshadows our rational world controls. Inflation was a plain indication of our present complete restraint upon the aggravation of debts and fluctuations of price level. Public employment was our ancestors' conception of socialist enterprise. But before the exodus to peace and freedom could be achieved, such scattered flashes of understanding had to ignite a steadier illumination. The conception of revolutionary world reconstruction had to spread from the few to the many, spread to them not merely as an idea and as a suggestion, but in such force as to saturate their minds and determine their lives. Then and only then could the necessary willpower be marshaled and directed to the effective reorganization of earthly affairs. A struggle for sanity had to take place in the racial brain, a great casting out of false assumptions, conventional distortions, hitherto uncriticized maxims, and impossible rights, a great clearing up of ideas about moral, material, and biological relationships. It was a struggle that, as we shall see, involved the passing of 3 generations. To an analysis of the factors and decisive forces in this struggle, our history must next address itself. Something between 8 and 10,000 million human lives in all were lived out during the age of frustration. Compared with the average lives of today, they were shorter and far less healthy. Nearly all of them had long phases of such infection, maladjustment, and enfeeblement as are now almost outside man's experience. The great majority of them were passed laboriously in squalid or dingy surroundings, in huts, hovels, cottages, tenements, and cellars almost as dismal as the ancestral cave and nearly as insanitary. A minority who could command the services of domestics lived in relative comfort and even with a certain freedom and luxury, at an enormous cost to the rest. This prosperous minority dwindled after 1931. It had vanished in Russia after 1917. There was a diminishing sense of personal security in the world, an enervating fear and uncertainty about the morrow through the ensuing years. There was what we find now, an almost incredible amount of mutual distrust, suspicion, irritation, and quarreling. Only a small proportion of the world's population lived to be peacefully and gracefully old in this phase of deterioration. Disease or a violent death became the common end again. One of the first general histories that was ever written was called The Martyrdom of Man, Winwood Read, 1871. In the age of frustration, it seemed to many that the martyrdom was mounting to a final, hopeless agony. Yet in the welter, there were also laughter, sympathy, helpfulness, and courage. Those fretted and painful lives interwove with threads of great brightness. Out of that melody of human distresses, out of the brains of men stressed out of indolence and complacency by the gathering darkness and suffering about them, there came first the hope, then the broad plan and the effort, and at last the achievement of that fruitful order, gathering beauty and happy assurance, in which we live today.